AMD released the 9070 XT 2 weeks ago now, and to say it's been a popular release would be an understatement. It's been reported that AMD's already shipped 200,000 RX 9070 series GPUs, and just days ago, AMD Japan claimed that they've reached 45% market share. Now, it's unclear exactly how accurate either of these claims are, but we know through our own sources that AMD's already managed to sell more 9070 series GPUs than Nvidia has their entire GeForce 50 series. So that's quite astonishing. So despite up to a 2-month head start, Nvidia's poor availability of GeForce GPUs is starting to see AMD take a serious chunk out of their market share, which long-term should be good news for AMD and not so good news for Nvidia, but of course we get to see how all of this plays out in the long term. As good as it is to have a competitive market, we're more interested in who's offering the better value product. And for this comparison, we're taking a more in-depth look at the 9070 XT and 5070 Ti. Now, you could argue, and I'm sure some people will, that the 9070 XT is priced closer to the RTX 5070 than it is the 5070 Ti. And it certainly is, according to the MSRP. But given we flat out do not recommend you buy the RTX 5070, there's not much point making that comparison, at least not for our initial comparison. So while I may very well add the RTX 5070 to this dataset in the future, I'm personally far more interested in the 5070 Ti versus 9070 XT matchup, and I'm sure many of you are as well. As a side note, we will continue to provide you with monthly GPU pricing updates, just like the one Tim made a few days ago now, so be sure to cross-reference this data with any future pricing updates. Now, for this test, I have covered 55 games at 1440p and 4K, which is why you haven't seen much content from me over the past week. I've been busy putting together this mammoth benchmark, and I'll go over the individual game data for around 20 titles, and then we'll take a look at how these two GPUs compare across all 55 games in a single graph, so let's get into it. We're starting with the bad for the Radeon GPU. The new Grand Theft Auto 5 enhanced version doesn't play nearly as well in the 9070 XT as it does the 5070 Ti, and as a result it's 29% slower at 1440p and then 24% slower at 4K. So not ideal, but hopefully AMD can improve performance here with a future driver update. We're also seeing that performance in ACC is very weak. It's certainly playable on the Radeon GPU, but weak relative to the 5070 Ti, as it was 35% slower at 1440p and 37% slower at 4K. Again, the hope is AMD can improve performance here with a driver update. Now, the 9070 XT was a little more competitive in Counter-Strike 2, coming in 10% slower than the 5070 Ti at 1440p and then 13% slower at 4K. The Rocket League results, though, they're quite unexpected. Somehow, the 9070 XT is 41% faster than the 5070 Ti at 1440p and 36% faster at 4K. This clearly has to be a GeForce driver issue, but it's a bit odd given Rocket League is both a popular and very well-established title, so you'd expect Nvidia to be on top of this one. Hunt Showdown 1896 was problematic for AMD, as the 9070 XT was considerably slower than the 5070 Ti, 35% slower at 1440p and 39% slower at 4K. So this is potentially yet another title with driver-related issues. Marvel Rivals was extremely competitive, as here the 9070 XT was just 7% slower at 1440p and 11% slower at 4K, so not bad given it currently costs around 17% less. Now, with very high quality ray tracing disabled, the 9070 XT does quite well in Black Myth Wukong, trailing the 5070 Ti by a mere 6% margin at 1440p and then 10% at 4K, so not bad overall. The 9070 XT performs quite well in Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and it's possible Radeon performance in general has improved since I first benchmarked this title. In any case, the 9070 XT was 13% slower than the 5070 Ti at 1440p and then 8% slower at 4K. Now, the Riftbreaker has never been a great title for AMD Radeon GPUs, and that remains true for this latest matchup, which sees the 9070 XT coming in 20% slower than the 5070 Ti at 1440p and then 24% slower at 4K. Using the ultra-high preset in F124 does enable ray tracing, and this has traditionally really hurt the performance of Radeon GPUs. But with Radeon A4, that is no longer the case, and in fact, the 9070 XT was able to match the 5070 Ti exactly at both of the tested resolutions. For testing War Thunder, I am using the DirectX 12 mode, which helps out the Radeon GPUs, but even so, the 9070 XT was still 18% slower than the 5070 Ti at 1440p and 13% slower at 4K. Interestingly, the Radeon RX 9070 XT was faster at 1440p, beating the 5070 Ti by a slim 6% margin, though performance at 4K ended up near enough to call identical. We also see a similar thing in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024, where the 9070 XT was 10% faster at 1440p, but at 4K the results are much the same. The Radeon GPU performed exceptionally well in Horizon Forbidden West, beating the 5070 Ti at both of the tested resolutions. At 1440p, we're looking at a 10% uplift, and then an 11% improvement at 4K. Next up, we have Warhammer 3, and this is a very positive title for AMD, as here the 9070 XT leads the 5070 Ti by an 11% margin at 1440p, and then 12% at 4K. So impressive margins given the Radeon GPU is much cheaper. Disabling path tracing in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle dramatically improves performance, and although the game still uses ray tracing, the 9070 XT was 15% slower than the 5070 Ti at 1440p, with 107 FPS on average, which I think is pretty good for native performance. It was then 21% slower at 4K, so not great, but also not terrible performance given we're looking at 67 FPS on average at native 1440p. Unfortunately, Nvidia still hasn't addressed Blackwell's weak performance in Space Marine 2, though they have noted there's an issue in this title, at least when I've talked to them directly. As it stands right now, in the more demanding scenes, GPUs like the 5070 Ti struggle more than what they should, handing the 9070 XT a 17% win at 1440p and then a rather massive 36% win at 4K. Now, I spent quite a bit of time trying to diagnose the Radeon performance issues in Gears 5. Now, look, granted the game, it ran, and performance overall was decent, certainly highly playable, but the 9070 XT was considerably slower than the 5070 Ti, 32% slower at 1440p and 33% slower at 4K. I have no idea why this is, but it's a bad loss for AMD. Thankfully, performance in the popular Rainbow Six Siege shooter was very good. Here the 9070 XT was just 7% slower than the 5070 Ti at 1440p, with both GPUs pushing well over 300 FPS. Then at 4K, the Radeon GPU was just 6% slower, and both pushed near 200 FPS at this extreme resolution, so overall, great performance. As always, Call of Duty is a Radeon special, and Black Ops 6 along with the 9070 XT is no exception, beating the 5070 Ti by a 22% margin at 1440p and then 19% at 4K, so a very solid win here for AMD. The 9070 XT trailed the 5070 Ti by a 9% margin in Stalker 2 at 1440p and then just 5% at 4K, so pretty competitive results here overall, and I think that's enough individual game data, so let's see how these GPUs stack up across all of the 55 games we benchmarked. Now, in our day one review featuring 18 games, I found that the 9070 XT was 6% slower than the 5070 Ti. And the good news is that that data is representative of a massive sample of games, as this 55 game benchmark saw the 9070 XT come in 5% slower than the 5070 Ti. The only real outlier in favour of the Radeon GPU was Rocket League, where the 9070 XT was somehow 41% faster, and then we see a handful of games where it was considerably slower, games such as ACC, Hunt Showdown, Gears 5, and GTA 5 Enhanced. What all this means is, for 65% of the games tested, so 36 out of 55, the margin was 10% or less in either direction, which explains the 5% margin overall. So let's see how they compare at 4K. Now, previously, using our review data, we found that the 9070 XT was just 1% slower than the 5070 Ti at 4K, but across 55 games, that margin increases slightly to 5% slower. So a 4% variance here, which is quite small, and the reason for this is the addition of titles such as Hunt Showdown, ACC, Gears 5, Gotham Knights, Homeworld 3, GTA 5 Enhanced, and the Riftbreaker. They all really hurt the performance of the 9070 XT, or at least the 9070 XT just didn't perform very well in these titles. Still, a 5% loss overall isn't exactly terrible, given the Radeon GPU costs at least 17% less, and I suspect there will be some driver improvements for a few of these titles which should help tighten that gap up a tiny bit. So there you have it. As it stands, across a wide range of games, the 9070 XT is around 5% slower than the 5070 Ti. So generally speaking, performance is fairly similar. Now, based on the MSRP, so $600 US for the 9070 XT and then $750 US for the 5070 Ti, the Radeon GPU is meant to cost 20% less, making it around 15% better value. Recently, we looked at the real retail pricing and found that the 9070 XT typically costs $750 US and the 5070 Ti $900 US, making the Radeon GPU 17% cheaper, so about 12% better value at those prices. Though again, we don't recommend you buy either GPU at these inflated prices, rather hold out and try and get one closer to the MSRP. Now, at the time of making this video, it was possible to purchase a 5070 Ti for $1,700 Australian. It was the MSI Ventus 3X model, and this was in stock at PCK, while the most affordable in-stock 9070 XT was the Gigabyte Gaming OC for $1,400 Australian. So an 18% saving there, making the Radeon GPU around 13% better value. So a very similar situation to what we see over in the US. Though at the time of making this video, Newegg, for example, had neither the 9070 XT nor the 5070 Ti in stock. Realistically, at this point in time, you're likely to purchase whichever model you can find in stock at a reasonable price. And there's a high probability that will see you buy a Radeon GPU, as the 9070 XTs are far more plentiful than the 5070 Ti. But in a world where both are available, I think the 9070 XT has to be 15% cheaper to earn our recommendation over the 5070 Ti. Because I think at 10%, I could really recommend either one of these, and at less than 10%, you might as well just get the 5070 Ti for its DLSS 4 support, superior RT performance, and of course it's generally a little bit faster overall. As for stuff like power and thermals, because some people are confused when that information isn't covered in these GPU head-to-heads, please refer to the day one reviews, as the power usage doesn't generally change, and for thermals it is best to check the partner card reviews, as that data can vary quite a bit from one model to another. Now, circling back, I mentioned DLSS 4 a moment ago, suggesting that it's a key selling point of the 5070 Ti, and that is indeed true. However, after careful analysis, we've found that AMD's new FSR 4 tech is exceptionally good, certainly worlds better than FSR 3, and even better than DLSS 3. In fact, we found it generally sits between DLSS 3 and DLSS 4 in terms of quality, so that is a huge win for AMD, and really improves the position of Radeon GPUs. That said though, game support does remain an issue, so this is something AMD will have to work on if they really want to close the gap to DLSS 4, but as it stands, AMD's upscaling tech is looking better than ever. Now, Nvidia still has the edge when it comes to ray tracing, though as is the case with upscaling, AMD has narrowed the gap here, and quite considerably. The 9070 XT, for example, was 26% faster on average than AMD's previous generation flagship, the 7900 XTX, when it came to meaningful ray tracing performance. And by meaningful, I mean the handful of RT-enabled titles where ray tracing offers a truly transformative experience, titles such as Alan Wake 2, Cyberpunk 2077, Dying Light 2, Spider-Man, and Metro Exodus Enhanced, for example. In all of those games, the 9070 XT was pretty competitive with the 5070 Ti, though once you add in titles such as Indiana Jones and the Great Circle along with Black Myth Wukong, the Radeon GPU ends up being about 20% slower on average. Still at 1440p with quality FSR upscaling enabled, the 9070 XT is generally very usable with a good degree of RT effects enabled, So it's no longer a case where Radeon GPUs are near enough to useless for any serious ray tracing. So keeping all of that in mind, we feel the 9070 XT is fairly evenly matched with the 5070 Ti, which is why it only requires a 15% discount to get a solid recommendation from us. Of course, this is a general recommendation. The GeForce GPU will offer a lot more value to someone who mostly plays games such as ACC, Hunt Showdown, Gears 5, or GTA 5, pending any driver improvements from AMD, of course, because it is possible performance in those titles I just mentioned will improve with a future driver update, but that's something we're going to have to test in the future and keep on top of this comparison. But yeah, as usual, research the performance for the games that you play, because that will largely dictate which one of these is going to be a better purchase for you, at least now. And yeah, that is going to do it for this head-to-head comparison between the 5070 Ti and 9070 XT. If you enjoyed the video, you know what to do. Subscribe for more content. Basically, tell me which GPU you'd like added to this data set. Do you want to see the XT compared to the non-XT next? Or do you want to see the non-TI model, so just the 12GB 5070 added to the mix? Let me know. Or maybe an older GPU, sort of an upgrade guide, RTX 3080, for example. Anyway, as I said, let me know about that in the comment section below. We also have the join button on Patreon if you want to get more Hardware Unboxed goodness and contact us more directly via our exclusive Discord server. We also do monthly live streams where we answer your questions there. So yeah, a lot of cool things there. So check that out if you're interested, but if not, that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.